She was sitting in the back of a police cruiser with her wrists in handcuffs and rain hammering the roof like something angry, and the man in the front seat was laughing, and what Simone Carter was thinking in that exact moment was not fear, not panic, not the particular helpless fury of someone who has been wronged. What she was thinking with complete and absolute clarity was this: he has no idea what he just stepped into. That was the beginning of the end for Brett Calloway, though he would not understand that for another 12 hours. But to understand how a woman ends up handcuffed in a police cruiser on a rain-soaked November night in South Baltimore, while the man who put her there laughs at his own good fortune, you have to go back 16 months to an apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, that was so clean and so sparse, it looked less like a home and more like a room someone had prepared to leave at any moment, which was in fact exactly what it was. The apartment had a bed, a coffee maker, a small kitchen table with one chair, and on the refrigerator, held by a single magnetic clip, one photograph. The photograph showed a woman in her early 30s standing at attention in a DEA graduation ceremony. Her expression serious, her posture perfect, her eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who has decided something about their life and intends to follow through. Standing beside her was an older woman in a yellow dress, whose face was cracked open with a pride so complete it looked almost painful. That older woman was her mother. That was the only personal object Simone Carter allowed herself in a life built for disappearing. Simone was 34 years old. She had been with the Drug Enforcement Administration for 8 years, had graduated in the top 3% of her Quantico class, and spoke the body language of danger the way other people speak their second language. Not perfectly, but fluently enough to survive. She had run 2 prior deep cover operations, one in Atlanta and one in Detroit, both resulting in the dismantling of major supply chains and the federal prosecution of men who had believed themselves entirely beyond the reach of consequence. She had never been burned. She had never flinched at the wrong moment. She had never let the weight of what she was doing drag her under. She was assigned to Operation Ironwood in the late summer, and the target was a man named Leon Graves. Graves was what the DEA called a logistics ghost, a cartel distributor who moved fentanyl and heroin up and down the eastern seaboard using a legitimate shipping company as cover, who had never been photographed in a context that mattered, who had never appeared in a courtroom, who had never so much as received a parking ticket, because he was meticulous about the distance he maintained between himself and anything that could be traced. 7 prior DEA attempts to infiltrate his network had ended badly. 4 burned operatives, 2 deaths. One case that collapsed so completely it took a federal task force 3 years to recover the credibility to try again. Captain Roland Webb, who ran the surveillance division out of a command center in downtown Baltimore, had laid out the case file in front of Simone on a Tuesday afternoon and told her the truth plainly. This assignment was the most dangerous thing he had offered anyone in 11 years, and he had not offered it lightly, and he would understand completely if she said no. Simone said yes before he finished the sentence. Webb had looked at her for a long moment across the table, and then said carefully that he needed to understand her reasoning. Operatives who wanted this kind of assignment for the wrong reasons, for the adrenaline, for the prestige, for the particular glamour that deep cover work sometimes attracted from the outside, were liabilities. He needed to know she was going in clean. What Simone told him was mostly true. She told him she was the best candidate, which was factual. She told him she understood the risk, which was also factual. What she did not tell him was the other thing, the thing that had lived in her chest for 3 years like a small, cold, very precise stone. Her cousin's daughter, Kezia, had been 19 years old and had died of a fentanyl overdose in a bathroom in East Baltimore. And the fentanyl that killed her had moved through the exact network that Operation Ironwood was built to destroy. Simone had held Sandra Kezia's mother in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning while Sandra shook so hard her teeth rattled. She had driven home afterward and sat in the parking lot of her apartment building for 45 minutes without moving. She had never put any of this in a report. She had never mentioned it to Webb. It was not a liability. It was a compass. There is a difference. She became Diamond Brooks over the following 14 months. Diamond Brooks was cold and efficient, and asked no questions and moved cargo for people who needed things moved discreetly, and she built her reputation the way you build anything that has to hold weight. Slowly, carefully, one small, reliable act at a time. She made minor deliveries. She kept her mouth shut. She was never late, never greedy, never curious. She earned trust the way a patient person earns anything, by demonstrating over and over and over again that she could be relied upon. By November, she was inside Graves's network, and the trap was set to close. The night of November 18th was cold and wet, and smelled of salt water and diesel from the shipping containers stacked along the East Harbor Industrial Corridor. And Simone was driving a dark blue Honda Accord south through the corridor with $600,000 in DEA-authorized marked bills in a duffel bag in the trunk. A GPS tracker woven into the canvas lining of the bag, a microcellular transmitting wire hidden beneath the collar of her jacket, and 3 miles behind her in a heavily armored surveillance van, Captain Roland Webb monitoring every breath she took. The plan was clean. The exchange point was established. Leon Graves's secondary contact had confirmed the handoff. Tonight was the night 16 months of patience became a federal indictment. Simone glanced in the rearview mirror at the dark road behind her and spoke quietly into the wire, her lips barely moving. "Roland," she said, "whatever happens tonight, let it play. Whatever I tell you, do not pull me early." Webb's voice came back after a pause that was not quite long enough to be comfortable. He said, "Copy that." She did not know then that the thing she was preparing for was not the only thing coming toward her through the dark and the rain. The overpass above the industrial corridor was a good spot if you knew how to use it, elevated enough to see 3 blocks in every direction, dark enough that you disappeared into the shadow of the concrete railing if you cut your headlights close enough to the main artery, that you could drop down into traffic in under 30 seconds if something worth pursuing materialized below. Brett Calloway had been using this overpass for 4 years. He knew exactly where to park. He was a large man, not fat, but dense in the particular way of someone who had once been athletic and had let the edges soften without losing the underlying structure. And he had big, square hands that were never quite still. In his left hand, he held a silver Zippo lighter, click open, click shut, over and over, in a rhythm so ingrained he no longer noticed he was doing it. The lighter had belonged to his father, a man who had smoked 2 packs a day for 30 years and died of something else entirely. And Calloway had carried it since the funeral without ever using it for its intended purpose. He had never smoked. He simply needed something to hold. He had been on the force for 18 years. The first 6 had been unremarkable in the way that honest work is often unremarkable. Shift work, traffic stops, the occasional arrest that meant something, a lot of paperwork that meant nothing. Then, in his 7th year, a supervising sergeant had shown him something. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way corruption gets dramatized in movies, with back rooms and envelopes slid across tables. It had been casual, offhand, almost domestic. A drug seizure had come in, and the sergeant had separated a portion of it before logging it, and he had explained to Calloway, in the tone of a man explaining something obvious, that the city paid them like they were replaceable and treated them like they were expendable, and that men who worked hard deserved to be compensated in proportion to the risk they carried. Calloway had thought about it for 2 days. Then he had stopped thinking about it and started doing it. The key insight, and he had come to think of it genuinely as an insight, a piece of hard-won wisdom rather than the thing it actually was targeting. You did not touch the organized. You did not touch anyone connected to a network large enough to notice the missing money, or the missing product, or the missing person, and send someone to ask questions. You touched the independent operators, the lone couriers, the mid-level dealers working without cartel protection. You touched people who had no recourse. You touched people who could not, by the nature of what they were doing, call the police to report that the police had robbed them. Calloway had looked at this reality and called it strategy. He had looked at it every morning for 11 years, and it had never once occurred to him to call it anything else. Sergeant Vince Morrow had been his partner for 7 of those years. Morrow was 51, heavier in the face and slower in the body than he had been when he started, with gray coming in at his temples and a manner that was less aggressive than Calloway's and more quietly corrosive. He had a tell that no one had ever pointed out to him and that he had never noticed himself when he was about to do something he understood to be wrong. His left hand moved to the collar of his uniform shirt and tugged it, a small, involuntary adjustment that accomplished nothing and meant everything. Parked on the overpass with the headlights off and the engine idling low, Morrow was doing it now. Tug, release, tug, while Calloway rolled the Zippo across his knuckles and watched the traffic below. "The city pays us peanuts," Calloway said, not for the first time. "It pays us to take bullets and write reports and show up when everyone else is run. You know what the city calls men who do that without complaint? It calls them reliable. You know what it calls men with nerve? It calls them dangerous. And I will take dangerous over reliable every single time, because dangerous is the only thing this city actually respects." Morrow tugged his collar. He said, "So what is the play tonight?" Earlier in the evening, one of Calloway's confidential informants had passed along a whisper. A woman, independent operator logistics broker who worked alone and kept to herself, was moving something significant through the East Harbor corridor tonight. The informant did not know what exactly. He knew it was large. He knew it was valuable. He knew she had no protection and no affiliation with anyone who would come looking if she disappeared into the system. Her name, apparently, was Diamond Brooks. She drove a dark blue Accord. $500,000, Calloway said, clicking the lighter open and shut. Maybe more. Independent, no organization, no retaliation. We hit her, we take the bag, we drop the inventory from the warehouse. Seizure in the trunk, the batch Vince signed off on as incinerated, and she goes away for trafficking. Clean, simple. We are done in 20 minutes. Morrow tugged his collar twice in rapid succession. He said, "And if she talks?" Calloway smiled. He said, "She is an independent contractor moving an undisclosed cargo through the industrial corridor at 2 in the morning. If she talks, she has to explain what she was doing. The moment she explains what she was doing, whoever she was doing it for sends someone to make sure she stops talking. She will take the plea. She will do her time. And we will be on a beach somewhere where the drinks have little umbrellas in them." He said it with the ease of a man who has run the numbers and found them entirely satisfactory. He was not wrong about most of it. He was wrong about the thing that mattered most. Below the overpass, headlights materialized in the rain moving south along the main artery, a dark blue Accord, unhurried, well within the speed limit, signal lights working perfectly. Nothing about it that constituted probable cause for anything. Calloway straightened in his seat. The lighter clicked once, twice, then went still in his hand. He put the cruiser in gear. He said, "Let us go introduce ourselves." The light bar hit first a sudden violent burst of red and blue that erupted in Simone's rearview mirror and painted the wet road in strobing color, and she felt the spike of adrenaline move through her system like an electrical current, sharp and immediate. And then she felt it pass because she had trained herself for exactly this, the surprise that precedes danger, and the training held. Webb's voice was already in her earpiece, low and urgent. "The plates," he said, "are task force, local anti-narcotics. They are not in our loop. They are not part of Operation Ironwood. They have no idea what they are touching." She said softly, understood. "What do you want me to do?" Webb said, "Play civilian. Diamond Brooks gets pulled over. She is nervous. She cooperates. She does not flash credentials. Graves has scouts on this route tonight. If they see you, produce a federal badge to walk away from a traffic stop, the entire 16 months burns to nothing. We lose Graves, we lose the case, we lose everything." She said, "Copy." She eased her foot onto the brake and pulled the Accord onto the gravel shoulder near the old Harmon Cannery building, the tires crunching through loose stone, the headlights cutting a pale cone through the rain and illuminating the rusted chain-link fence and the dark bulk of the building beyond it. She killed the engine. She rolled down the window. The night came in immediately, cold, wet, carrying the smell of tide water and old iron and rain on hot asphalt, and underneath all of it, Faintly, the brine of the harbor 2 blocks east. She watched the side mirror. 2 figures emerged from the unmarked cruiser. The larger one came toward her door. The other circled wide to the passenger side and moved toward the rear of the car. She settled into the role. She let her breathing change, let her posture lose the precise correctness of the training, and take on the slightly contracted quality of a woman caught somewhere she did not entirely want to explain. She put both hands on the steering wheel where they were visible. The mag light hit her face like a small sun held deliberately high, deliberately blinding, a technique designed to put you on the defensive before a single word had been exchanged. She squinted against it and kept her hands still. "Officer," she said, keeping her voice at the register of polite confusion, with an edge of genuine discomfort underneath it. "Is there a problem? I was just heading home. I do not think I was speeding." The man holding the flashlight leaned into the window far enough that she could smell him stale coffee and something sour underneath it, the smell of a man who had been sitting in a car for hours. He said, "I did not ask for your opinion. Your tail light is out. License and registration, now." She reached slowly into the glove box, telegraphing every movement, both hands visible at all times, and produced the documents identifying her as Diamond Brooks, a forged identity so thoroughly constructed that it would pass any check the local task force could run. He took the documents without looking at them and slipped them into his breast pocket. Then he said, "Step out of the vehicle." She said, "For a broken tail light, officer. I really do not feel comfortable stepping out in the pouring rain. Could we just handle this here?" He did not wait for her to finish. He yanked the door handle and the door swung outward, and his hand closed on her upper arm, and he pulled her out of the car with the particular efficiency of a man who has done this many times and has stopped noticing what it feels like to the person it is being done to. She came out of the car, and he turned her and pushed her against the rear panel, and the cold metal came up against her cheekbone, and the gravel shifted under her feet, and she heard the rain loud on the roof of the car, and she felt the calculated roughness of the pat-down, and she absorbed all of it and gave nothing back. From the far side of the car came the sound of the trunk being opened. In the surveillance van, Webb's hand was white-knuckled on the console edge. Around him, 4 tactical agents had gone very still in the way that people go still when they are restraining themselves from doing something they want badly to do. Webb said quietly and without room for argument, "Hold your positions. Let them commit the crime. We have audio and visual. We have everything we need. Do not move." The silence from the trunk lasted 3 seconds. Then she heard Morrow's breathing change a small, involuntary intake, the sound a man makes when he sees something that exceeds his expectations. Then she heard the zipper on the duffel bag. Then she heard Calloway's voice from beside her, low and satisfied. "Well, well." She turned her head just enough to see Morrow lifting the bag over his shoulder with one hand. With the other, he reached into the deep side pocket of his cargo pants and withdrew 2 rectangular bricks wrapped in brown tape, dense, heavy, the particular compressed weight of controlled substances seized from a warehouse 8 months ago and signed off as incinerated on official paperwork bearing Morrow's signature. He set them in the trunk with the careful placement of a man putting something where he intends it to be found. "Look what we have here," Morrow said, stepping back. "Somebody has been busy tonight." Calloway pulled her arms back and the handcuffs came out and the ratchet clicked down on her wrists, too tight, deliberately so the metal biting into skin in a way that would leave marks. And he pressed her face against the wet surface of the trunk lid and spoke directly into her ear. He said, "Nobody is coming for you, sweetheart. Nobody ever does." She was face down against cold, wet metal with the rain on her back and her wrists cuffed and $600,000 in federal money disappearing into a corrupt cop's hands, and the evidence that would send her to prison for a decade sitting 10 inches from her face. And what she did in that moment was nothing visible. She did not flinch. She did not struggle. She simply noted the words he had just spoken, filed them in the part of her mind where she kept things she would use later, and spoke into the wire so quietly that only the equipment 3 miles away could hear her. "Roland," she said. "They took the bag. They planted. Every word is on tape. Let it breathe." Webb's voice came back after 1 second. He said, "Copy. Let it breathe." She let them put her in the back of the cruiser. She let the door slam. She sat in the dark with the rain on the roof and waited, and in the front seat, Brett Calloway was already laughing, and she was already counting. The 31st precinct at 1 in the morning smelled the way all precincts smell at 1 in the morning. Burnt coffee from a machine that had been running since the previous afternoon. Industrial floor cleaner that had been mopped over too many times to actually clean anything anymore. The particular stale sourness of a building where people are nervous and confined. And underneath all of that, the faint chemical bite of the fluorescent lights that ran overhead in a frequency that was just slightly wrong. Just slightly too much like the building itself was trying to keep you from getting comfortable. Simone was processed with the efficient indifference that the booking system extends to everyone who passes through it, which is one of the few democratic qualities of the criminal justice system. A board officer took her photograph flash the moment recorded Diamond Brooks narcotics trafficking, and rolled her fingerprints and entered her into the database and directed her to an intake room where she removed her jacket and turned out her pockets and submitted to a pat-down conducted by a female officer who looked like she had been awake for 20 hours and was managing it by feeling nothing. Calloway stood at the booking desk in his element, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup, taking his time with the arrest report. He was meticulous about the lie. He documented the traffic stop, lane violation, lawful initiation, observed, behavior consistent with nervous concealment. He documented the request to exit the vehicle and the subject's initial resistance and his decision to effect the removal. He documented the search of the vehicle and the discovery of 2 bricks of heroin in the trunk, each measuring approximately 1 kilogram, consistent in packaging with narcotics trafficked through the East Harbor distribution network. He documented the arrest, the charges, the booking. He documented none of the $600,000 because, as far as the official record of this evening was concerned, the $600,000 had never existed. He signed his name at the bottom of the report with the easy confidence of a man who has written a great many false reports and has never once been asked to explain any of them. Morrow countersigned. The holding cell was number 7, down a corridor that smelled of bleach and something organic underneath the bleach that the bleach had not entirely conquered. And when the door closed behind Simone, the sound it made was the specific, heavy clang of steel on steel that means something final, at least temporarily. She sat on the bench, cold metal, the vinyl surface cracked and patched with tape from 3 different decades, and put her forearms on her knees and looked at the wall. She was not afraid. She had been in worse rooms. What she felt was something more precise than fear, something closer to the particular controlled patience of a person who has waited a very long time and is now being asked to wait slightly longer. She began methodically to count the federal charges she had witnessed in the last 2 hours: theft of federal property, civil rights violations under color of law, evidence tampering, perjury on a sworn affidavit, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances using stolen government property. Each count had a mandatory minimum attached to it that she knew by memory. The total was not comfortable for the people who had just locked her in this room. She did not smile, because that would have been indulgent. She simply sat with the numbers and waited. In South Whitfield, 40 minutes from the precinct, Calloway's garage was a different kind of room entirely. The garage was detached from the house, accessible through a side door off the driveway, and Calloway had reinforced the locks himself and installed blackout panels on the single window because he had learned early that the things you want to keep must be kept in the dark. A single work light hung from a hook in the ceiling and threw a harsh white circle over the metal workbench where $600,000 in banded currency was currently laid out in neat rows, the bills separated by denomination. The smell of them, sharp and slightly chemical in the enclosed space. Fresh ink, slightly damp from the condensation on the bag. The particular smell of paper that has been under pressure for a long time. Calloway stood over it with his hands on his hips and the lighter clicking in his left hand, open, shut, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is looking at something he has been working toward for a long time and has finally arrived at. He said, "There it is, Vince. There is our exit strategy right there on that bench." Morrow was on his second beer, leaning against the workbench with his collar tugged loose at the left side. He said, "How do you want to move it?" Calloway said he had been thinking about this for months. The storage unit business his brother-in-law ran in Dundalk was the vehicle. Not fast, not dramatic, just slow and incremental small amounts entering the business accounts as storage rental income over 6 to 8 months. Unremarkable and untraceable. By summer, the money would be clean and moved to an account somewhere far from here. By fall, he would be somewhere warm with no paperwork attached to his name. Morrow asked, and Diamond Brooks. Calloway picked up a stack of bills, felt the weight of them, the crisp resistance of new paper, set them back down. He said she gets arraigned tomorrow morning, and Judge Brewer is on the bench, and Brewer has been putting trafficking cases away for a decade like it is a personal mission. She will not get bail. She will sit in county for 2, maybe 3 years before she sees a trial date. And when she finally gets to trial, she has a choice to make. She can tell the truth about what she was doing in the East Harbor corridor at 2 in the morning with $600,000 in unmarked cash in her trunk, and whoever she was working for sends someone to make sure she never finishes that sentence. Or she takes the plea and does her time and gets out eventually and starts over somewhere else. Either way, she is not our problem. He said it with the unhurried certainty of a man who has thought through every contingency and found them all manageable. "The city takes from us," he said, leaning back against the wall and clicking the lighter one more time. 18 years of taking. Consider this the balance coming level. Morrow looked at the money. He tugged his collar. He nodded. What neither of them knew what the sealed and locked and blackout-paneled garage in South Whitfield could not protect them from was that every bill on that workbench was micro-stamped with invisible ink registered in a federal database, and that a GPS tracker woven into the canvas lining of the duffel bag was transmitting its location with quiet persistence to a secure monitor in a federal command center downtown, and that a man named Captain Roland Webb was looking at a blinking red dot on a digital map and writing down the address in South Whitfield with the neat, deliberate handwriting of someone who intends to use it very soon. Calloway clicked the lighter one final time. He pocketed it. He reached up and switched off the work light. The garage went dark. The money disappeared into it. At 4:17 in the morning, the Federal Command Center on the 3rd floor of an unremarkable office building above a parking garage in downtown Baltimore was still fully lit and fully occupied, and the people in it had the focused, slightly over-caffeinated quality of professionals who have been awake long enough to have moved past tired into something sharper and more precise. Captain Roland Webb sat at the head of the central table. He had been in this room for 11 hours. He had the kind of face that revealed very little under normal circumstances, and even less under pressure. And the only visible sign of the weight he was carrying was the way his right hand rested flat on the table, fingers spread, completely still. The posture of a man consciously preventing himself from doing something he cannot do. Across from him, AUSA Diana Mercer had spread an organized array of printed wire transcripts across her section of the table, with the methodical precision of someone who has done this many times and knows exactly where each piece belongs. She was in her late 40s, a former public defender who had made the uncommon journey from defending the accused to prosecuting the powerful, and she brought to that work the particular quality of someone who has seen the system from both sides and has developed a corresponding intolerance for the ways it fails. She did not emote over evidence. She organized it. Special Agent Marcus Hale of the FBI Public Corruption Unit stood at the window with a coffee he had stopped drinking 20 minutes ago and was still holding out of habit. Hale was the kind of person who had spent so many years investigating corrupt law enforcement that he had developed a comprehensive understanding of the species. He could tell you from a set of behavioral markers approximately how long a dirty cop had been dirty, whether they operated alone or in partnership, whether they were motivated primarily by money or by power, and what their likely response to being cornered would be. He was rarely surprised. He preferred it that way. Webb ran through the night's events in the flat, sequential voice of a man delivering a debrief, the tale on the Accord, the stop at the cannery lot, the physical removal, the discovery and theft of the federal funds, the planting of the narcotics, the booking, the false affidavit. All of it captured on the wire with timestamps. All of it now sitting on a federal server in a file that would, if printed, run to several hundred pages. Mercer listened with her eyes moving across her transcripts, and when Webb finished, she did not say anything for a moment, and then she began to build the case out loud, the way an architect walks through a blueprint, not with excitement, but with the measured authority of someone describing something they have already constructed in their mind, and are now simply translating into words. Theft of federal property, mandatory minimum, 8 years. Civil rights violations under color of law, each count independent and stackable. Evidence tampering, perjury on sworn federal documents, conspiracy to distribute controlled narcotics using stolen government evidence. She paused between each charge to let it settle. Then Hale turned from the window and said the heroin. He had cross-referenced the narcotics they had planted against the precinct evidence logs. The batch matched a warehouse seizure from 8 months prior, a seizure that appeared in the official records as having been transferred to a licensed destruction facility and incinerated under a court order that bore Morrow's signature as supervising officer. The incineration had been documented. The documentation was false. The narcotics had not been destroyed. They had been removed from the evidence room by the men who seized them, stored somewhere private, and deployed tonight against a woman they had never met. That was not merely evidence tampering. That was the sustained operation of a private criminal enterprise using the infrastructure of a law enforcement agency as its vehicle. That was a separate charge stack with its own minimums. Mercer nodded slowly. She said, "How many prior operations do we think used this same inventory?" Hale said, "Unknown until we get the physical evidence. But the GPS on the bag puts the money in a residential garage in South Whitfield. We execute the search warrant at first light, and we will know considerably more." Webb said, "And Simone?" There was a pause that was brief, but not nothing. Webb had sent operatives into difficult situations before. He had made the calculation in each case that the intelligence value of the operation justified the temporary exposure of the operative, and he had been right often enough that he still held the position he held. He had also twice been wrong in ways he did not permit himself to think about at command center tables at 4 in the morning, because there was nothing to be done with that kind of thinking at 4 in the morning. He said, "She stays in holding until we are ready to move. She understands the play." Hale set down the coffee cup and picked up a manila folder from the table and slid it across to Mercer. The folder contained a federal arrest warrant signed 2 hours earlier by U.S. Magistrate Judge Harold Branch, bearing 2 names. Mercer took the folder, opened it, reviewed the warrant without rush, and signed her name on the co-filing line. She said, "Tomorrow afternoon. We let them file the arraignment paperwork in the morning, let them think they are walking into a commendation. Then we close the trap." Webb looked at the blinking red dot on the monitor. South Whitfield, still stationary, still exactly where they had left it. He breathed once. He turned back to the table. He said, "Let us make sure she knows we are moving." He reached for his phone and dialed the direct line to the holding desk at the 31st Precinct and asked to be connected to the prisoner in cell 7. The line rang 4 times, and then a guard's voice said with the particular bored authority of a man performing a bureaucratic function that the prisoner in cell 7 was not available to receive calls until processing was complete, and that he should call back in the morning. Webb thanked him and hung up. He stood at the window for a moment, looking at the city. The rain had not stopped. The lights of the port were faint and dispersed in the wet air, and the streets below were empty and dark and completely indifferent to what was happening inside the building he was standing in. He breathed once. He turned back to the table. He said, "Then we wait." The light that came through the single, high window of holding cell 7 at dawn was the gray, tentative light of a November morning that had not yet committed to being a morning, thin and cold, and carrying no warmth at all, and it fell across the concrete floor in a pale stripe that moved almost imperceptibly as the minutes passed. Simone had not slept. She had not expected to. She had instead spent the last several hours doing something that looked from the outside like nothing, sitting still on a metal bench, forearms on knees, eyes not quite focused, but was in fact a particular kind of active waiting that she had developed over years of work that required patience in uncomfortable environments. She was not thinking about the discomfort. The bench was hard, and the room smelled of bleach and something biological underneath the bleach, and the temperature was calibrated to be just slightly too cold for comfort. And she registered all of this and set it aside the way you set aside background noise when you are listening for something specific. What she was thinking about was Kezia. She thought about Kezia often, though not in the way that grief usually works, not with the raw edge that the first year had carried. The year when she would sometimes be in the middle of an entirely unrelated activity, and the fact of Kezia's absence would arrive without warning and stop her completely. That had softened with time, not because the loss mattered less, but because she had found a way to carry it differently. The way you learn to carry something heavy by shifting how you hold it. Kezia was 19 when she died, and she had been the kind of 19-year-old who still called her grandmother every Sunday, and had a plan for her life that she described with the slightly embarrassed enthusiasm of someone who has not yet learned to be cynical about their own ambitions. The fentanyl that killed her had moved through Leon Graves's network. Simone had spent 16 months inside that network. Whatever happened in this cell, whatever was still coming, she had done what she came to do. A guard came down the corridor and slid a paper cup of lukewarm coffee through the slot at the bottom of the cell door without making eye contact with the efficient non-acknowledgement of a man who has been trained not to engage with the people on the other side of the bars because engagement makes the job harder. Simone leaned forward and picked up the cup. The warmth of it against her palms was modest and real, and she held it for a moment longer than necessary. In the cell adjacent to hers, she could hear a woman, mid-30s, from the sound of her, with the particular vocal quality of someone who has been crying for a long time, and has run out of tears, and is now simply talking the way people talk when they are frightened and alone. The woman was saying that she did not know the drugs were in the car, that it was her boyfriend's car, that she had 3 children and a job interview on Thursday. Simone listened. The woman was not lying. Simone had spent years developing the ability to distinguish between a person constructing a false account and a person telling a true one, and the woman in the next cell had the particular specific quality of truth, the irrelevant detail that a liar would not include, the slightly disorganized sequence of a memory being retrieved rather than a story being assembled. She was telling the truth. Simone could not help her today. That was one of the specific agonies of the work she did. You could not save everyone on the way to saving more, and knowing that the mathematics were correct did not make the individual cases easier to sit next to. She finished the coffee. She set the cup on the floor. At 9:15, the sound of footsteps in the corridor, purposeful, specific. The footsteps of someone who knows where they are going and does not need to look at the numbers on the doors. A voice at the booking desk, crisp and unhurried, presenting a credential and requesting a private attorney-client consultation with the prisoner in Cell 7 on federal grounds. 5 minutes later, Simone was escorted to a small interview room, windowless, a single table, 2 chairs bolted to the floor, and the door clicked shut, and she was alone. Then the door opened again, and Diana Mercer came in. Mercer was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, and she was carrying a coffee that was considerably better than the one Simone had been given through the cell slot, and a small paper bag from which she produced, without comment, a cheese Danish that was slightly squashed from being transported in a jacket pocket, but was otherwise intact. She set both items on the table and sat down across from Simone without preamble. She slid a folded piece of paper across the surface. Simone opened it. One line, "We have everything. Today is the last day they ever wear a badge." Simone read it, folded it, set it down. She said, "And Graves." Mercer said, "Because you held your cover, Graves's network believes Diamond Brooks was an independent courier who got intercepted on a routine run. His people made contact with a secondary broker this morning to replace the lost capital. Tactical is moving on the warehouse tonight with everything you built over 16 months. Operation Ironwood closes tonight, Simone. Both targets, same night. Simone was quiet for a moment. She picked up the coffee and held it in both hands, the way she had held the cup through the cell door slot with both hands for the warmth of it. She said, "How do we do this?" Mercer allowed herself something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. She said, "We give them the stage they think they have already won. We let them walk in, expecting a commendation. Then, we introduce them to the room." Simone drank the coffee. She said what time. The intercom in the 31st Precinct crackled to life at 1 in the afternoon, with the flat, institutional authority of a system that does not modulate for context or mood. Officers Calloway and Morrow report to Captain Reed's office immediately. Dress uniforms required. Brett Calloway was in the break room when he heard it. One hand on the coffee machine, and the effect of those two words, dress uniforms, was immediate and visible. A slight expansion of the chest, a straightening of the posture, the physical vocabulary of a man whose assumption has been confirmed. He had slept 4 hours and had come in feeling the particular elevated quality of a man who has placed a large bet and has already begun calculating what he will do with the winnings. The summons fit perfectly into the narrative he had constructed for how this day would go. He clicked the Zippo open and shut twice, tucked it back in his pocket, and went to his locker. In the adjacent row, Morrow was already there, pulling his dress uniform jacket off its hook, and Calloway noticed, not for the first time, because he had noticed it for years without ever commenting on it, that Morrow's left hand was at his collar, pulling the fabric slightly to the left with a small, involuntary motion that had become as natural to him as breathing. Calloway said, "Dress uniforms, Vince." "You know what that means?" Morrow said, "Commendation." Calloway said, "Or press." "Major narcotics bust, 2 kilos off the street, local hero angle. Either way, we are walking out of that office in better shape than we walked in." Morrow's collar hand stilled. He nodded. He looked at his reflection in the small mirror on the inside of his locker door, and something in his face was not quite right. Not doubt, exactly, but the particular expression of a man who is trying to convince himself of something he does not entirely believe. He had learned over 7 years to defer to Calloway's confidence in situations where his own failed him. It had served them well enough until now. They walked through the bullpen together in dress uniform, and the bullpen did what bullpens do when something significant has shifted, and no one wants to be the first to say so. It went slightly too quiet, the ambient noise of keyboards and radio chatter and shuffled paperwork dropping a degree below its normal level, the way a room goes quiet when people know something they are not supposed to be seen to know. Calloway did not notice. Morrow noticed, and chose not to think about it. They climbed the stairs to the second-floor corridor, where Captain Reed's office occupied the corner position with frosted glass walls and a view of both the bullpen and the street, and Calloway knocked twice with his knuckle, the brisk knock of a man expecting a welcome, and pushed the door open. The room was wrong. He understood it in layers the way you understand something that contradicts your expectation. First, the surface reading, which was that the room was crowded in a way he had not anticipated, and then the specific inventory of who was in it, each person landing with increasing weight. Captain Reed was behind his desk. He was the color of old concrete, and his hands were resting flat on the blotter in the particular way of a man who is holding himself very still to avoid doing something involuntary. 2 people in dark tactical vests with FBI across the front in yellow stood to Reed's left. By the window, holding a manila folder with the contained attention of a person who has been waiting patiently for a specific moment to arrive, was a woman in a charcoal blazer whose expression was the expression of someone doing a job they are very good at. And in the center of the room, arms crossed, making no concession whatsoever to the social norms that usually smooth the edges off confrontation, stood a man whose bearing communicated a single thing with absolute clarity. This room is no longer arranged in your favor. Calloway's right hand went to his pocket. The lighter was there. His fingers closed around it. He felt the metal, the familiar weight, the small, reliable solidity of it. He did not take it out. Morrow tugged his collar. 3 times, rapid. The hand would not stop. The man in the center of the room said, "Come in. Close the door behind you. We have a great deal to discuss." Calloway went for the script immediately because the script was all he had, and he was not yet ready to admit that it had already stopped working. He said he did not know what this was about. He said they had just closed a major narcotics case. He said if this was about the arrest report from the previous evening, he was happy to walk through it point by point because the documentation was thorough and complete. The man in the center of the room, Special Agent Marcus Hale, who had been investigating corrupt law enforcement officers for 14 years and had developed an extraordinary capacity for not being impressed by them, reached into his jacket pocket and set a small audio recorder on the surface of Captain Reed's desk. He pressed play. The sound that came out of it was high definition and completely clear. No static, no distortion, just the ambient sound of a car interior and rain on glass, and two voices that were unmistakably, unambiguously, the voices of the two men in dress uniforms standing in the center of the room. Calloway heard himself say 500,000 at least. Independent, no cartel affiliation, no retaliation. We hit her, we take the bag. We drop the inventory from the warehouse. Seizure. The batch you signed off as incinerated in the trunk. She goes away for trafficking. We retire. The words filled the room, and then the room held them. And Calloway's Zippo lighter fell out of his hand. He had not meant to drop it. His fingers simply lost their grip on it as the full architecture of what was happening arranged itself in front of him with the terrible clarity of a thing that has been true for a while and is only now becoming visible. The lighter hit the carpeted floor with a small muffled sound that in the silence of the room was somehow very loud, and he did not reach down for it. His knees moved in a way they had not moved since approximately the last time something had truly frightened him, which had been a long time ago, and he put one hand on the back of the nearest chair to keep himself organized. What hit him was not the audio. The audio was just sound. What hit him was tactile, a specific physical memory that arrived without warning and with complete sensory detail. The weight of the duffel bag when Morrow had lifted it out of the trunk of the Accord and slung it over his shoulder. The way it had settled. The sound of the zipper. The brief green-gray glow of the banded currency in the ambient light of the street lamps. He had thought in that moment, standing in the rain on the gravel shoulder of the cannery lot, "This is what I deserve. This is what 18 years of this city taking from me looks like when the balance finally corrects." He understood now with a completeness that was almost physical in its weight, that the bag had never been there by accident, that the woman in the car had known what she was doing from the moment the light bar hit her mirror, that every word he had spoken from the overpass onward had been recorded and stored and was now being played back in a room that contained the full judicial authority of the federal government. He had not robbed a cartel mule. He had walked into a trap that had been set by someone considerably more capable than he was, and he had walked in carrying his own evidence, and he had locked the door behind himself. He looked up from the floor. She was standing in the doorway. Not Diamond Brooks, not the wet, frightened, slightly panicked woman he had shoved against the rear panel of a car and cuffed too tight and locked in a holding cell and not thought about since. The woman in the doorway was wearing a DEA tactical uniform that was pressed and immaculate, and her gold badge caught the light from the overhead fluorescence, and her duty weapon was secured at her hip, and her face held no anger whatsoever, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. What her face held was the specific quality of someone who has been working toward something for a very long time and has arrived at it exactly as planned. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Not at the room, not at Hale, not at the folder in Mercer's hands. At him. With eyes that had been watching him since the overpass, since before the overpass, since long before he had any idea she existed. She said, "Hello, Brett." "Hello, Vince. I believe you have something that belongs to the United States government." Morrow made a sound that did not resolve into a word. His hand moved toward his collar and stopped midway, frozen there, as though the mechanism had simply given out. Calloway said, "This is a setup." Simone said, "It is. You set it up yourself." Starting at approximately 11:47 last night on the overpass above the East Harbor corridor. We have the audio from there as well. Hale stepped forward and read the charges with the measured, unhurried cadence of a man who has done this many times and understands that the charges themselves are the argument that what they mean is already decided, and what remains is only the formal act of stating them. Conspiracy to commit theft of federal property. Civil rights violations under color of law, multiple counts. Evidence tampering. Perjury on sworn federal affidavits. And the final charge, the one that made Morrow actually sit down without being asked. Conspiracy to possess and distribute Schedule I controlled narcotics using stolen government property. Calloway attempted to invoke the union. He said he wanted his union representative present, that this was a hostile interrogation of a law enforcement officer without proper departmental notification, that he intended to challenge the legality of whatever proceeding this was supposed to constitute. Mercer stepped forward. She set a document on the desk in front of him with the quiet finality of someone placing the last piece of evidence a case will ever need. And she read from it in a voice that was entirely without performance. Federal arrest warrant signed by U.S. Magistrate Judge Harold Branch, issued on the basis of probable cause established through lawful federal wiretap, conducted under Title III authority, fully bypassing local and state jurisdiction. She looked at Calloway. She said, "There is no union representative for a federal arrest, Brett. There is no departmental notification process. There is no local authority in this room. What is in this room is a federal warrant, 2 federal agents, and enough evidence to ensure that the next meaningful choice you make will be from behind a defense attorney." Calloway said the audio was doctored. Simone said the wire was under my collar when you shoved my face against the trunk of my car. Every word you said into my ear is on tape. The room was quiet in a very particular way. Hale nodded to the 2 agents. They moved with the economical efficiency of people performing a familiar task. Calloway was turned smoothly and without drama, and his arms came back and the handcuffs went on. The ratchet sound was the same sound he had made on Simone's wrists the night before, the same deliberate tightness, the same metallic closing of something that does not reopen. Simone took 1 step forward, and she spoke quietly enough that the sound did not carry beyond the 2 of them. The same register, the same proximity, the same words he had breathed into her ear in the rain on the cannery lot gravel. She said, "Nobody is coming for you, sweetheart." She said it without venom, without satisfaction, without triumph. She said it the way you state a fact that does not require your feelings to be true. That was what made it carry the weight it carried. Not rage, not relief, just the clean, simple accuracy of a thing returned to the person who first said it. Calloway closed his eyes for a moment. Morrow did not resist. He simply put his hands behind his back and held them there and waited. And there was something in that gesture that was not resignation, but something closer to relief. The relief of a man who has been performing a thing for so long that being stopped is its own kind of rest. They were walked out of the captain's office and through the bullpen, and the bullpen watched in the particular silence of people witnessing something they will describe to others for a long time. No bluster, no protest, no performance. Just the sound of boots on linoleum and the hum of the fluorescence and the specific metallic weight of consequence being walked toward a door. Simone stood in the doorway of the captain's office. Calloway's silver Zippo lighter was still on the floor where it had fallen. No one had moved it. No one would. It would be catalogued and photographed and entered into evidence and placed in a box in a federal storage facility, and it would remain there for as long as the case was open, which would be a very long time. That same evening at 11:47, Leon Graves was removed from the back office of a warehouse facility in the Outer Harbor by a DEA tactical team, moving on 16 months of intelligence that Simone Carter had built from the inside, piece by piece, at considerable personal cost. He was placed in a federal transport vehicle without incident. He had been told what was happening to him, and he had said nothing, which was, everyone agreed, the smartest decision he had made in years. 2 operations, 1 night, both closed. The morning after exists in 3 places simultaneously, which is how mornings after usually work. Not in a single location where the event occurred, but distributed across the lives of all the people the event has rearranged. At the federal detention facility on the east side of the city, Brett Calloway was sitting on the edge of a bunk in a holding cell that smelled of antiseptic and industrial paint, still in the clothes he had been wearing under the dress uniform jacket that had been taken from him during processing, and he was looking at his hands. His hands were resting on his knees with the palms turned upward, slightly open in the posture of a man who is used to holding something and has nothing to hold. The Zippo was gone. The badge was gone. The service weapon was gone. His hands had been full for 18 years, and now they were empty, and he did not know what to do with them. Down the corridor, in a separate holding cell, Vince Morrow was lying on his back on the bunk, looking at the ceiling with the specific, focused attention of a man trying to find something in a blank surface that is simply not there. His left hand every few minutes moved to his collar, found the standard-issue shirt, tugged it. The motion had lost all meaning. He kept doing it anyway. At the downtown Federal Command Center, Simone was showered and in civilian clothes, and sitting across the central table from Webb and Mercer with a cup of coffee that was considerably better than anything that had been available in the last 20 hours, going through the Operation Ironwood documentation with the methodical attention of someone who is not celebrating, because there is still work to be done. The Graves indictment needed to be airtight. 16 months of work deserved an airtight indictment. Webb set the coffee in front of her without comment. He watched her for a moment, the way she sat, the way her hands moved through the paperwork, the particular quality of her attention that told him she was fully present and fully functional. And then he sat down and opened his own folder and said nothing, because some things do not need to be said by people who have worked together long enough to understand each other's silences. Mercer cleared her throat. She said, "There is something else." During the pre-dawn search of Calloway's personal vehicle, a 2019 Ford Explorer parked in the precinct lot and subject to the federal warrant issued by Judge Branch, FBI, forensics had located a lockbox. It was bolted under the rear cargo floor, beneath a removable panel, accessible only if you knew it was there, and had the key, which they had found on Calloway's personal keychain. Inside the lockbox, pre-seized narcotics in 2 separate quantities, 3 prepaid burner phones with call histories that were going to take several weeks to fully analyze, and a handwritten ledger in what had been confirmed as Calloway's handwriting. The ledger had 14 entries. Each entry had a date, a location, an amount, and a name. The entries spanned 6 years, 14 separate incidents, 14 people who had encountered Brett Calloway and Vince Morrow at night in the industrial corridor and had come away with criminal charges attached to substances that the ledger confirmed had come from Calloway's private inventory rather than from anything found on their persons or in their vehicles. 14 people who had in every case that Mercer's team had been able to verify overnight been convicted and sentenced. 14 people currently serving time, or who had served time for crimes constructed by the men who were now in holding cells on the east side of the city. Simone looked at the ledger page that Mercer had printed. She read the 14 names. The 13th entry was a name she did not know. Darnell Pruitt, 29 years old. Stopped in the East Harbor corridor 3 years ago. Charged with narcotics possession. Convicted on the basis of physical evidence found in his vehicle during a search that the arrest report described as consensual. He was currently in county lockup, year 3 of a 5-year sentence. Mercer said his case is already being reviewed. The conviction will be vacated. He will be home by the end of the week. Simone set the paper down. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone absorbing a weight that is both expected and still heavy when it arrives. She thought of Kezia. She thought of the woman in the cell adjacent to hers the night before the woman with 3 children and a job interview on Thursday. She said, all 14. Mercer said all 14. It will take time, but yes, all 14. Simone picked up the coffee. She held it in both hands. She said, good. 7 months passed in the way that federal cases pass, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the grinding cumulative momentum of a process designed to be thorough rather than fast, assembling its architecture, one verified fact at a time, until the structure it has built is so solid that a defense has no surfaces to push against. The United States District Courthouse occupied a full city block of downtown Baltimore, its marble lobby and high-ceilinged courtrooms carrying the particular institutional gravity of a building that has seen serious things happen for a long time and has developed over decades the quality of a place where performance is recognized for what it is. Courtroom 7B was smaller than people imagined when they pictured federal trials. Smaller and quieter and more serious. The air in it slightly cooler than comfortable, in the way of rooms where important decisions are made. Calloway and Morrow had been transformed. Calloway sat at the defense table in a gray suit that had been purchased in a hurry and was 2 sizes wrong in the shoulders hanging off him in a way that made him look like a man wearing someone else's clothes, which was, in a sense, exactly what he was doing. The silver lighter was not there. His hands had spent 7 months learning to exist without it and had not managed it. He kept folding them on the table, then unfolding them, then folding them again, a man whose habit had been taken from him and who had not yet developed a replacement. He looked older. He had lost weight in the specific way of people who are not eating because the food is bad, but because the situation has made appetite feel irrelevant. Morrow sat beside him with his eyes forward. He had stopped tugging his collar approximately 6 weeks into the pre-trial period, not because the impulse had gone away, but because he had noticed himself doing it while alone in the holding cell one evening, and had understood in that moment that the tell had been there his entire career, and that no one had ever called it out, which meant he had been performing his own guilt in front of the people he was deceiving for 7 years without any of them noticing, and the understanding of that had made the gesture feel grotesque. He had put his hand in his lap and not moved it again. The gallery was full. It was full every day of the trial. There were journalists, 2 city council members who had said nothing publicly and were there to observe privately, and in the front row of the gallery, in a section that had been quietly reserved by Mercer's office, were 14 people. They did not know each other except in the way that people know each other when they have been subject to the same violence. Not intimately, not socially, but with the shared recognition of people who have been in the same room with the same particular darkness. They sat with the quiet, serious attention of people for whom this proceeding was not an abstraction. Darnell Pruitt sat at the far end of the row. He was 29 years old and looked both younger and older than that younger, in the softness of his face. Older in the way he held himself, the careful, considered posture of someone who has learned that the world does not automatically protect him, and who moves through it accordingly. His mother sat beside him with her hand on his arm, in the light, steady grip of a woman who has waited a long time for this room and intends to be fully present in it. Mercer's opening statement was not theatrical, it was organized. She laid the case out with the methodical precision of someone who has spent 7 months ensuring that every fact is sourced and every source is credible, and she moved through the charges with a clarity that left no interpretive room. Here is what happened. Here is the evidence that it happened. Here is the law that makes it a federal crime. Here is the consequence. The defense attorney, a court-appointed man named Vincent Brower, who was competent and professional and completely clear-eyed about the position he was in, argued entrapment. He argued that the DEA had created a situation designed to produce the outcome it obtained, that Calloway and Morrow had been manipulated into actions they would not otherwise have taken, and that the government could not manufacture a crime and then prosecute the manufactured result. Mercer's rebuttal was a single, clean paragraph she delivered without notes. Entrapment requires that law enforcement induced a person to commit a crime they would not otherwise commit. The audio from the overpass, recorded before Calloway or Morrow had any contact with Simone Carter or the vehicle she was driving, established that the decision to identify, follow, stop, rob, and frame a woman in the East Harbor corridor was made independently on the basis of information entirely unrelated to any DEA activity, by 2 men who had been doing exactly this for 7 years. The DEA did not create the predators. The DEA walked into their territory and watched them work. Simone took the witness stand on the 4th day of testimony. She walked into the courtroom in her DEA uniform, and the gallery went very still in the particular way of rooms adjusting to the arrival of something significant. She moved to the witness stand with the same quality she brought to everything not dramatic, not performed, simply present and completely deliberate. And she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Her testimony was delivered in the same register she used for everything, calm, precise, chronological. She described the evening of November 18th from the moment she turned onto the East Harbor corridor to the moment she was placed in holding cell 7, and she did it with the relentless specificity of a trained observer. Times, locations, distances, the exact pressure of the handcuffs on her wrists, the exact words Brett Calloway had said into her ear in the rain. She described each moment without editorializing, without reaching for the emotional charge that was available in every sentence if she had wanted to take it. She did not want to take it. The facts, stated plainly, carried more weight than anything she could add to them. On cross-examination, Brower suggested that she had placed herself in a dangerous situation with full knowledge of the risks, and that her decision to maintain cover rather than identify herself had contributed to her own temporary detention. He asked whether she felt any responsibility for the events of that evening. Simone looked at him for a moment before answering. She said, "I maintained my cover because breaking it would have allowed a cartel distributor to remain at liberty and continue supplying the substances responsible for 23 documented deaths in the East Baltimore community in the prior 2 years." She paused. She said one of those 23 people was a 19-year-old girl from the neighborhood where I grew up. I did not break my cover because the people I was working to protect were worth more than my discomfort for one evening. The jury was looking at her. Brower said he had no further questions. Darnell Pruitt took the stand on the 6th day. He walked to the witness stand in a quiet suit, pressed and clean, and he sat down and folded his hands on the railing in front of him and looked at the jury with the measured, careful expression of a man who has thought a great deal about this moment and has decided how he wants to inhabit it. He described the night 3 years ago when he had been driving home from a double shift at a warehouse facility. He was specific about this. The 16-hour shift, the exhaustion, the particular relief of getting into his car at 2 in the morning and knowing he was heading home. He described the lights in his mirror. He described the stop, the removal from his vehicle, the roughness of it, the confusion, the particular terror of a man who knows he has done nothing wrong and is watching the official documentation of a crime being assembled around him in real time. He described the trial. He described the sentence, 5 years of which he served 3 before the conviction was vacated. He described what 3 years does to a life that was being carefully built. The job gone. The apartment gone. The relationship with his son, who was 2 years old when he went in, and 5 years old when he came home and looked at him in the doorway of his grandmother's house with an expression of recognition that was also unmistakably the expression of a child looking at someone who has been away long enough to become, partially, a stranger. He did not rage. He had had 3 years in a cell to decide what he would do with his anger, and he had decided to spend it on building things rather than burning them, because burning took energy he did not have to spare. But when he reached the part about his son's face in the doorway, the 5-year-old who had learned to read while his father was away, who had grown 18 inches, who called his grandmother Mommy out of habit, and then corrected himself in front of Darnell with an expression of guilty confusion that broke something in Darnell that was still not entirely mended. His voice broke, once a single crack in the measured surface, and then it steadied. The jury was not looking at Calloway. They were not looking at Mercer or at the documents on the evidence table. They were looking at Darnell Pruitt, and their faces held the particular quality of people who have understood something completely and are deciding what to do with the understanding. The jury went out at 3:15 in the afternoon, and the waiting began, which is its own kind of testimony. The waiting room outside a jury deliberation, with its bad lighting and its plastic chairs and its vending machine coffee, has a particular quality that cannot be replicated by any other kind of waiting, because what is happening on the other side of the door is the formal measurement of what a group of human beings believe to be true, and the knowledge that the measurement is occurring changes the air of the room it is happening near. Simone sat in the corridor with Webb beside her, both of them with coffee cups they were working through slowly, the way you work through something when the action is elsewhere, and what is available to you is only patience. Webb had his legs stretched in front of him and his jacket off, and he was looking at the middle distance with the air of a man who has learned not to spend waiting time on outcomes he cannot influence. They did not talk much. There was not much to say that was not already said. 2 benches down the corridor, Darnell Pruitt was sitting with his mother, her hand in his. And at one point in the early part of the wait, he looked up and found Simone looking at him, or perhaps she found him looking at her, and they held that for a moment. 2 people who had been in the same institution on the same night for entirely different reasons, and had arrived by entirely different routes at this corridor outside this room. And then he nodded once, and she nodded back. And that was the whole of what needed to be said between them. The jury returned at 9:30 in the evening. The courtroom reconvened with the particular focused quiet of a room that has been doing something serious all week and is now approaching its conclusion. And the jury filed back in and the foreperson stood, a woman in her 50s with the composed expression of someone who has thought carefully about what she is about to say and is ready to say it. And the room held its breath. Theft of federal property. Guilty. Civil rights violations under color of law. Count 1. The assault and false imprisonment of Special Agent Simone Carter. Guilty. Civil rights violations under color of law. Counts 2 through 15, encompassing the 14 victims identified in the ledger. Guilty on all counts. Evidence tampering. Guilty. Perjury on the arrest affidavit submitted in federal proceedings. Guilty. Conspiracy to distribute controlled narcotics using stolen government evidence. Guilty. The words accumulated in the room like weight being added to something until the structure beneath it was no longer capable of holding. By the time the foreperson reached the final count, the courtroom had the quality of a room after a long storm, the tension still present in the air, but changed, redirected, resolved into something that was not quite peace, but was the precondition of it. Calloway had been staring at the wall above the judge's bench since the 3rd verdict. Not at the foreperson, not at Simone, not at the gallery where the 14 people from the ledger were sitting. At the wall where there was nothing. His hands were still on the table in front of him, folded, and the folding looked effortful, as though the act of keeping his hands in a neutral position required his complete attention. Morrow put his face in his hands. Not weeping, not performing, simply covering it. The gesture of a man who cannot look at the room anymore and has decided the interior of his palms is preferable. He sat like that until the judge called for order. Simone, in the back of the courtroom, exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the exhale of someone who has been carrying a specific breath for a long time and has been given permission to release it. The sentencing hearing convened 2 weeks after the verdict in a smaller courtroom, lower ceilinged and more concentrated, the kind of room where there is nowhere to hide from the business being conducted. The air in it was cooler than it needed to be and smelled of wood polish and the particular paper smell of legal documents stacked in quantity. Federal Judge Constance Okafor presided. She was 61 years old, had been on the federal bench for 19 years, and was known among members of the defense bar and the prosecution alike for 2 specific qualities: the absolute even-handedness with which she treated every case and her complete categorical intolerance for the abuse of public trust. She had never, in 19 years on the bench, reduced a sentence for a public corruption conviction on the grounds of the defendant's prior service record. She considered prior service an aggravating factor, not a mitigating one, on the basis that greater authority created greater responsibility for its proper use. She looked at Calloway over the rim of her reading glasses with the dispassionate focus of someone performing an assessment. She said, "Mr. Calloway, please rise." He rose. He was wearing the same gray suit which had not improved with repetition. His hands hung at his sides with nothing in them. The Zippo was in a federal evidence box somewhere in this building, catalogued and sealed, and the absence of it was in his hands not a dramatic absence, just the physical fact of hands that had held something for years and did not hold it anymore. Judge Okafor did not raise her voice. She spoke in the measured, unhurried register of a person for whom the gravity of the proceedings did not require amplification. She said you were given a badge which is not merely a piece of metal. It is a formal agreement between an individual and the community that individual has agreed to serve. That agreement is specific. In exchange for the authority the badge confers, the holder accepts an obligation to use that authority in the service of the people who extended it. You received that agreement. You accepted its terms. And then, within 6 years of accepting it, you began deliberately converting that authority into a tool for your own enrichment, at the direct expense of the people you had agreed to protect. She said you did not target people who were dangerous. You targeted people who were vulnerable. You targeted people who could not report what you were doing to them because the institution they would have needed to call was the institution you were weaponizing against them. You understood this. You relied on it, and you sustained that reliance for 7 years. She said the woman you assaulted, framed, and imprisoned on the night of November 18th was a federal agent conducting an operation of significant public safety importance. You did not know that. You did not care. She was not a federal agent to you. She was a target. And that is the precise nature of your crime. Not that you picked the wrong person. That you were the kind of person who picks people. Calloway's knees bent. Not a collapse, but a bend, the involuntary microflexion of joints under a load they were not designed to absorb alone. The marshal beside him shifted slightly, close enough to catch him if necessary. Judge Okafor said Brett Calloway, on the consolidated federal charges of which you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers, I sentence you to 22 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This sentence carries no possibility of early release or parole. Your municipal pension is permanently and irrevocably forfeited. The liquidated value of that pension will be distributed as court-ordered restitution to the 14 individuals identified in the evidence ledger in proportion to the time each individual served as a result of your actions. The gavel came down once. Calloway received the sound of it somewhere in his chest, a physical impact without physical cause. He closed his eyes for one moment. When he opened them, he was looking at the wall again, and it still had nothing for him. Morrow was ordered to stand. He stood. His left hand moved one final time to the left collar of his suit jacket, and then he looked at his hand, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone encountering themselves clearly for the first time in a long time, and his hand dropped. Judge Okafor addressed him with the same measured voice. His seniority was not a mitigating factor. 18 additional years of experience meant 18 additional years of choosing each day to continue. The harm done to Darnell Pruitt, who sat in the gallery as she said this, his mother's hand on his arm, was a harm Morrow could have chosen not to do at any of the 1,095 days that preceded it. Vince Morrow, 18 years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. No possibility of parole. Municipal pension permanently forfeited. The second gavel strike. The marshals moved. Calloway was turned and cuffed, and the metallic ratchet of the handcuffs going on his wrists was the exact sound at the exact wrists where he had put them on Simone Carter. As they were walked toward the side door of the courtroom, Morrow passed the front row of the gallery, and his eyes found Darnell Pruitt, as the geometry of the room made inevitable. And for one moment, they were looking at each other across a distance of approximately 6 feet. The man who had taken 3 years from a young father, and the young father who had spent 3 years waiting for exactly this room. Morrow looked away first. He would look away from that face for the rest of his life. Simone stood in the back of the room. She waited until both men had passed through the door. She breathed. 6 months after the sentencing, the shape of what remains arranges itself across multiple lives simultaneously in the way that consequences always distribute themselves, not concentrated in a single location, but spread across the geography of everyone who was changed. Brett Calloway was in the Special Housing Unit at USP Cumberland, the institutional description of protective custody. The practical description of a former law enforcement officer who cannot be placed in the general population without serious risk to his safety. His cell was 8 feet by 10 feet. The walls were concrete, painted a beige that had yellowed. The fluorescent light overhead ran 24 hours a day and could not be switched off, which meant that sleep was a negotiation with the light rather than an absence of it. The silver Zippo was gone. His hands knew it the way hands know the absence of something they have held for decades, reaching in sleep, finding nothing, returning to stillness. The motion happened less frequently now, but it had not stopped. Some habits outlast their objects. His wife had filed for divorce within 3 months of the sentencing. The house in South Whitfield was in foreclosure under the restitution order's asset lien. His children were with their maternal grandmother in another state, living in a different school district, and the oldest one had requested a different last name in a letter that Calloway had been given a copy of and had read 3 times and then folded very carefully and placed in the space beneath the mattress where he kept the things that mattered. He was 50 years old. He would be 72 if he served his full sentence. He did the arithmetic most days not out of self-pity, but practically the way you account for what is actually true when you are trying to orient yourself in a space with no useful landmarks. Vince Morrow was 2 facilities away at a federal correctional institution in Western Virginia. He had been in his cell for 6 months. He had stopped tugging his collar entirely. He had not replaced the habit with anything. His hands rested in his lap when he sat and at his sides when he stood, and he had developed the particular stillness of a person who has stopped performing for an audience that no longer exists. In the East Harbor Industrial Corridor, the unmarked cruiser on the overpass was gone. The anti-narcotics task force that Calloway and Morrow had operated within had been dissolved, pending a federal review, and reconstituted with a new supervisory structure that included mandatory body cameras, real-time data logging of all traffic stops, and a civilian oversight board with actual subpoena authority, not as a cosmetic gesture, but as a functional requirement of the consent decree the city had signed with the Department of Justice as part of the settlement of the 14 civil claims arising from the ledger. A woman drove through the corridor at midnight on a Thursday in April, a nurse on her way home from a double shift at Harbor General. Her car well-maintained, and her speed exactly legal. Her mirror clean of lights for the entire length of the corridor. She made it home in 11 minutes. She parked in her spot, gathered her bag, went upstairs. The corridor was empty behind her. Darnell Pruitt's job interview at the Hargrove Logistics Company near the port had taken 40 minutes. He had worn the suit from the trial pressed and clean, and he had sat across from a woman named Patricia who had reviewed his application with the focused attention of someone who reads carefully rather than skimming, and who had looked up from the expungement paperwork when she finished reading it and said with the matter-of-fact directness of someone getting to the point, "We are looking for people who are reliable and honest and who show up. Can you show up?" He had said, "Yes, ma'am. I have been waiting 3 years for the chance to show up." She had offered him the position. They had shaken hands. He had checked the time on his phone as he walked out of the building, 2:40 in the afternoon. His son Deshaun was at school. Pickup was at 3:15. He had exactly enough time. He drove toward the school with the radio on, and the window cracked a cool air moving through the car. And he thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of extraordinary, to be driving toward his son with a job and an afternoon, and nothing closing in from any direction, nothing waiting in the mirror. He arrived at the school at 3:12 and parked and got out and stood by the car and waited. And at 3:17, Deshaun came through the double doors with his backpack bouncing and his shoe untied, and found his father with his eyes across the yard, and ran the way 6-year-olds run without any of the restraint that the world eventually teaches people. And Darnell caught him and held him, and the weight of him was everything. She drove to East Baltimore on a Tuesday afternoon in April with the windows down, which was perhaps optimistic given that the temperature was 53 degrees, and the wind off the harbor had the particular cold clarity of a wind that has not yet decided to become spring. She drove because she needed to move, not because the distance was significant, 23 minutes from her apartment in Alexandria, but because driving was one of the ways she thought, and she had been thinking about this visit for several weeks, in the way that you think about things you know you need to do, and keep finding reasons to defer. The neighborhood was the neighborhood she had grown up in and had left at 18 and had returned to at intervals over the following 16 years, with the complicated relationship of someone for whom a place is simultaneously home and history. The row houses on Elkin Street were the same colors they had been when she was 8 years old, or close enough. She parked in front of the row house at the end of the block. The house had a small concrete yard with a rose bush in it that was not yet flowering, but was very clearly alive green and reaching toward whatever light was available. She went inside. Sandra was in the kitchen making tea, which was what Sandra did when she was expecting someone and wanted something to do with her hands. She was 57, and she had aged in the specific way of women who have carried significant grief and have not been destroyed by it, but have been changed by it. She looked at Simone when she came through the kitchen door and did not say anything for a moment. Just looked at her, and then she said, "Sit down. The water is almost boiling." They sat at the kitchen table with their tea, and the window was open despite the cold, because Sandra always had a window open somewhere, said she could not breathe properly in a fully sealed room. The air that came in was cool and smelled of the city concrete and something green underneath it, the early April smell of things beginning again. Sandra knew what Simone had done. She did not know the operational specifics, and Simone would not have given them to her, but she knew enough that Simone had spent 16 months inside the network responsible for Kezia's death, that she had sat in a holding cell overnight as part of it, that a cartel distributor named Leon Graves was now in federal custody awaiting trial on charges that included the distribution of fentanyl, responsible for 23 documented deaths in the East Baltimore community over 2 years. That among those 23 was a 19-year-old girl named Kezia Washington, who had wanted to be an occupational therapist and had called her grandmother every Sunday and had had a plan. Sandra said she would have liked knowing somebody did something. Simone held her mug with both hands, the warmth of it against her palms. She nodded. They drank their tea and did not try to fill the silence with anything, because the silence was not empty. It was full of the person who was not there, the way all silences in houses where someone is missing are full of the specific quality of the missing person. And sitting in it together was not sad in the way that sadness usually announces itself, but in a quieter way, more like acknowledgement. Simone thought about the woman in the cell adjacent to hers on the night she was in, holding the woman with 3 children. The woman who was telling the truth in the particular way that truth sounds when it has nowhere to go. She did not know what had happened to that woman. She hoped she was home. She thought about Darnell catching his son in the schoolyard, the weight of Deshawn in his arms, the shoe untied, the backpack bouncing, and the particular, irreplaceable ordinariness of that moment after 3 years of its absence. She thought about the nurse driving through the corridor at midnight and getting home in 11 minutes. She did not think about Calloway. He was in a room somewhere with his empty hands, and he would be in that room for a long time, and the world was not organized around his comfort or his understanding of what he had done. That was not her concern. Her concern was the world that existed now that he was not in it the way he had been. Sandra refilled her tea without asking. The gesture was so ordinary and so specifically Sandra, the quiet assumption of care, the filling of the cup without making it a moment, that Simone felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly unmoored for a while. She sat with it. She let it settle. Brett Calloway stares at the wall of his cell at USP Cumberland in the hours before dawn, when the fluorescent light is identical to the fluorescent light of every other hour, and the dark outside the small window above the bunk has no particular quality of night. His hands reach, sometimes the old habit, finding nothing. The gavel sound lives in his chest now, the specific weight of it, permanent. His pension is gone. His name means something different than it used to. Only the number remains. The East Harbor Industrial Corridor at dawn. Salt air and the first pale light coming in low over the tops of the shipping containers. The water of the harbor catching it and holding it briefly before it changes. The overpass is empty. It has been empty for months, and it will remain empty. And on the street below, a young woman walks to a bus stop in the early morning, carrying a backpack and moving through the corridor without once looking over her shoulder. Because there is nothing behind her that requires looking at. Justice does not make announcements. It simply makes a different world possible. Simone Carter drives back to Alexandria with the windows down and the cold April air moving through the car and across her hands on the wheel. And she is not Diamond Brooks, and she is not an operative, and she is not in a holding cell or a surveillance van or a federal courtroom. She is simply herself, driving home, carrying what she carried into all of it, and carrying it still, because you do not set down the people who sent you into the work when the work is done. You carry them forward. You carry them into the next one. There is always a next one. But today, for this hour, there is just the road, and the wind, and the quiet that comes after something hard has been done, and done correctly, and that quiet is enough. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath through every moment of it, please take a second right now and hit that like button. It is the simplest thing you can do, and it makes a genuine difference for our channel, helping stories like this reach the people who need to hear them. If you are new here, hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because we have more stories coming that carry the same weight, the same stakes, and the same belief that justice, when it finally arrives, is worth every moment of the wait. And drop a comment below right now. Tell us which moment hit you hardest. Was it the night on the cannery lot, or Simone walking into that office? Was it Darnell on the stand, or the sound of that gavel? We read every single comment, every one, and we want to hear from you. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that the truth still matters. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next story.